Hello music makers, welcome back. After the first video I did giving away some of my useful Ableton racks, plenty of you have been spotting even more of them in my recent sessions, asking what does that one do? And can we have them, of course. So, if you want to make your life easier and speed up your workflow, yes, you can have some more. On one condition though. You watch this video first so I can show you how to use them. Deal? Okay, deal. Let's go. Okay, so this rack is called RevRev. It's short for reverse reverb. Some of you may be used to using this effect already, but this is a quicker version. For those of you who don't know where you might use a reverse reverb, I can guarantee you've heard it before, you just probably didn't know what it was. Let me show you an example. So we have a vocal here that comes in after some amount of bars. One interesting way we can transition into that vocal is with the reverse reverb effect. The normal way of doing this is we take a little snippet from the start of the vocal, we douse that in lots of reverb, then we re-record that signal as new audio. Then we take that new audio, reverse it, and line it up with our vocal so that we get this nice swell-in effect to introduce the vocal. Like that. Now, to save you all of that bother, we can do the same kind of thing in a rack instead. If we insert the RevRev onto our vocal channel here, take that same vocal snippet, then we just have to automate the level for the length of the effect. This is basically just a long reverb send. Then for very long periods of time, we can freeze that reverb. So we pick any point after the start to begin our freeze. Then all we have to do is draw in our fade. Easy as that. It's also really easy to adjust, as opposed to having to go back and change reverb settings and then re-export the reverb tails, etc., etc. You could do all this as automation on the fly. This rack is swing delay. I've already done one video on this actually, but not many people saw that, as it is a pretty niche application and I advertised it in the context of UK garage. But it's just as useful in genres like house and techno, wherever the groove is swung, basically. You can watch that video for the full details, but while we're here, let me give you a quick example. This track we have here is swinging. The drums are swung, the bass is swung, and the arp is swung too. Everything, basically. That's typically what you want, unless you want parts to start tripping over each other. Otherwise, it can start to sound like a DJ crashing the mix, or what's known in the north of England as a pots and pans mix, because it can sound like you've just opened a cupboard overstacked with pots and pans. If you don't know the sound I'm talking about, let me change just this one hi-hat part. If I stop this hi-hat part swinging, you'll hear it start to clash with the rest of the groove. There, did you hear how awkward that got? Well, seeing as delay is just basically extra note repeats, beat clashes can happen with delay too. Now, I know normally you are not going to just add delay to the whole of the drums like this. I'm showing you this on a percussive part because it sounds more obvious. But this applies to any instrument that's grooving. Leads, arps, basses. While we're here though, let me show you a practical example I sometimes do with drums. Imagine we wanted to add interest to this loop every 4 bars or so. Sometimes I like to take the clap at the end of the phrase and throw it into a delay or reverb. But did you hear that? If we want to use 16th repeats, we can't do it with a normal delay because delays are straight, and if our groove is swung, it's going to trip up the groove. But with this rack, we can swing the delay. This rack is the DJ Tools. Anyone who saw my last arrangement video will have seen this one in action. It's essentially 7 effects in one, and the idea is it's quick access to all the classic effects you would find on a typical DJ mixer. So we've got a low cut for breaks and builds. We have a filter. A resonator. We have a delay send, preset to the most common DJ rhythm. We have a flanger here, layered in such a way that it won't destroy the frequency balance. We have a one knob reverb, set up so it can't get too messy. And lastly, we have a chopper. In other words, stutter effect. Ever since my video on stereo things went quite well, a lot of you have requested this one, the De-Binaural-izer. It's basically a crosstalk plugin for headphone users with some amateur psychoacoustics thrown in there. And if you didn't understand any of those words, don't worry. In a nutshell, its purpose is just so that you can judge width and effects like reverb easier on headphones. If you don't know why those things are harder to get right on headphones, let me quickly explain. It all comes down to the fact that headphones aren't stereo. Technically, they are binaural. What's the difference, you ask? Well, if you think about how we hear sounds in real life, we have 2 ears and we receive sound in both of them all of the time. Even a sound that is coming directly from our right at 90 degrees, some of that sound still gets to our left ear. In fact, the whole reason we can detect the sound is coming from the right is because of the differences in what our ears receive. It's not just down to the fact that the sound coming from the right will be louder in our right ear. There's lots of other factors too. The sound that the left ear receives will be slightly behind in time because it takes time for sound to travel. It will also have less high frequencies because our head is in the way. And we can also pinpoint its location from any bounces off nearby walls. This is how the human hearing system judges direction. And this calculation is instant. It's how we've survived as a species, being able to tell which direction danger is coming from. Anyway, think about what happens when listening to sound via headphones. Headphones have none of that. The sound coming into our right ear does not reach the left ear at all. The left and right are completely segregated. What's called binaural. If you want to know more on that, Dan Worrell has done a great video, but in the meantime, all you need to know is if you work on headphones, you can use this rack to de-binauralize the experience. Just make sure you remember to turn it off when you're listening on speakers, and especially remember to turn it off when you're mixing down the track. This rack is called Headroom. I often get questions regarding gain staging. You'll have seen that word before if you've ever been looking at mix tutorials. But what does it mean? Well, gain staging is just being conscious of the level which certain processors are being fed. Gain staging is not a concern for linear processors. So to give you an example, this digital EQ, like the one built into Ableton here, this EQ does not care if it receives minus 40 decibels or plus 20. Doesn't matter. It's going to do its job the same every time, regardless of what level is coming into it. However, if I take this EQ and then boost some frequency by a massive amount, like 10 dB or 15 dB, and then send that signal on to another processor which is non-linear, that's when we need to be concerned. Let's discuss non-linear plugins. So a non-linear processor is something which is dependent on its input level. For example, a distortion or a saturation. Those are going to do different things depending on how much level is going into them. The louder the signal on the way in, the more distortion or saturation you're going to get from them. Another example of a non-linear processor would be a compressor, because the signal has to go above the internal threshold before compression starts. And then there are more subtle forms of non-linear, like anything that's modeling an analog circuit. Non-linear processors are calibrated to expect some kind of predetermined average level. Unfortunately, though, each one is different. There's no standard for this kind of stuff. Some processors, like the ones I have here, do give you some control over that expected level, but some don't. So let's pretend these don't, and I will give you an example. So I've got a saturator and a tape emulation here. They are placed on my master channel. The level reaching my master channel is already full mastered level. We are up to and beyond 0 dBFS. And one thing we can be pretty certain of is it's very unlikely a non-linear plugin will be expecting a signal anything near 0. It's usually much nearer a quarter of that level, which would be -12 or even -18. So when I enable these, you'll hear what happens. As you might have predicted, they crap out. Even before we start playing with any kind of drive controls, it's already too much. Too much signal on the way in, and they can't handle it. Well, this might sound pretty sick actually if you're making genres like funk, but this isn't what we're after. We need something a lot more subtle. That's where Headroom comes in. It's a very, very simple rack, but if you work at high levels like me, super handy. It's just 2 utility plugins in series. The first one turns down the signal. The second one compensates by the same amount back upwards. So if we place our non-linear processors in the middle of those two, we can reduce the signal going into them whilst hearing the same volume back out the other end, and thus judging the sound properly. Smudge Echo 2 is a rework of my Smudge plugin from the first video. I've managed to simplify it quite a lot, and it also works in a lot more scenarios. In a nutshell, Smudge Echo is just a transition plugin. It's basically a high-pass filter into a delay and a reverb. So it has the effect of smudging or smearing the sound, which is a great way of transitioning into new sections. So here's an example. I wanted the first drop into this track just to be bass and drums. But in the intro building up to that, I already have this piano and guitar riff, which is one of the main hooks to the song. Now, if I just stop that riff suddenly when the bass comes in, we're going to miss it. It's going to sound like there's a big hole where lots of mid energy was. So instead, to transition out of it, I can smudge it across to the next section. Now, we don't just have to use this on individual tracks. We can use this on the whole master if we want. between this and the DJ Tools rack, you could make a whole arrangement just using those two racks. Okay, lastly, a lot of you have been asking how to make your own, so I thought I would give you a quick tutorial. For this example, I'm going to use this verse vocal here. It has lots of gaps in between the phrases. What I'm thinking is we fill those gaps with some really atmospheric, swirly echoes. I don't have a plugin which gives me swirly echoes, so let's make one. My plan is just to take a simple delay, and for the swirliness, I'm going to add a flanger to the delay repeats, not to the main vocal. And then also I'll show you how to set up a ducking system, so that the echoes are only there when the vocal has stopped. In the link in the description, along with all the other racks, you'll find this, the send template. By the way, if you want to know why I'm using a send as an insert effect and not using a send track, go watch the previous racks video. So let's put that on our vocal. We can open the rack with this button here. Inside, you'll notice two lanes. One is the send, one is the dry signal. That means our effect has its own parallel path, and the dry signal is left alone. Let's add our delay effect to the send path. I'm going to place it after this utility because the utility is pre-mapped as our volume sending into the delay. So we need that beforehand. We also need this to be 100% wet. Remember this for any effect you place here, because we don't need to mix in the dry signal anymore because that has its own path. We just need the effect on this path, so 100% wet. Next, let's grab our modulation, our flanger. This effect does not have to be 100% wet because now we are affecting the echoes only. So we can judge how much of the echoes versus flanger we want with this wet-dry control. Although in this case, I want my echoes to be extra swirly. So this is probably going to be maxed. And lastly, for the ducking, we're going to use a compressor. So let me grab one of those. By the way, you'll also notice at the end here, pre-mapped, I have put an EQ with a high-pass filter and a low-pass filter ready to go, because it's always handy to restrict the highs and lows of your send effect so they don't get in the way of the main signal too much. Right, let's set up our macros. I only want control over the delay timing. So right-click, map to macro 2. I need control over the delay repeats. So let's map feedback to macro 3. Then let's map the modulation amount, the flanger amount, to macro 4. And then the way we make the echoes duck out of the way of the vocal is a sidechain on the compressor. So we select our own track, but we need to select pre-effect. So when the vocal is present, the compressor is going to duck our effect. And when the vocal stops, the compressor will let the effect go back to its original volume. So for the amount of ducking, I'm going to map the ratio control, because ratio is just the amount of compression. And I'm going to make sure our threshold is very low. So it doesn't matter how quiet the vocal is, it's going to catch it. Right, that's all we need. Let's test it. Good stuff. That works. Let's just throw some atmospheric reverb on and we're done. Okie dokie, I hope you learned something. If you did, you know what to do. Press some buttons for me. The link to the racks is in the description below, as is a link to buy me a coffee, should you feel so generous. And until next week, I will see you in the comments. Bye-bye.